Well, good morning. My name is Tim Freilich, and I'm the executive director of Madison House. Madison House is an independent nonprofit organization here that coordinates the volunteer service and community engagement of about 3,000 UVA students each year. But prior to joining Madison House, I was legal director of the Immigrant Advocacy Program at the local Legal Aid Justice Center here in Charlottesville. And I have to say that during my 15 years with the immigrant advocacy movement here in Virginia, and particularly as a white immigrant advocate from Virginia, nothing was more exciting and wonderfully disruptive than the emergence and rise of an immigrant youth-led immigrant advocacy movement here in Virginia. And so I'm honored to moderate this panel today. We'll be taking a look at civic engagement among immigrant and undocumented youth. And we have three distinguished panelists who I'll introduce in course, who are here with us to share their thoughts. And at the end of all these presentations, as in the first session, then we'll be taking questions from the audience. So please, as we're hearing these presentations, please think about your questions. To begin, first, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Will Perez of Claremont Graduate University. Dr. Perez is a teacher, a writer, a winner of many awards, and one of the nation's leading academic experts on undocumented students. And he'll be sharing his his presentation reflections on the civic contributions of undocumented youth. Dr. Perez.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning to talk about, sort of a passion as a researcher in highlighting the contributions of immigrant youth, and in particular, undocumented youth. So before describing some of my work and some of my observations about national trends in terms of undocumented youth civic engagement, let me just give you a demographic context so that you get a sense of the obstacles and challenges that oftentimes undocumented youth have to contend with and overcome in order to participate civically in a variety of ways in their communities and on their school campuses. So approximately there are about 10 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Within that, there are about 2.4 million youth under the age of 24. And in that context, there are about 14.5 million individuals in the United States today that live in what is known as mixed status families. So what does that mean? That means that at least one member of the family, could be mom, could be dad, could be a sibling, does not have legal status. And among this 14.5 million, there are 5 million US-born citizen children of undocumented immigrants. And to add to that, I just came back from a research Fulbright in Mexico, and there are approximately 2 million deported Mexicans in Mexico today. And among that, there are 1 million deported and forced return Mexican children in Mexico. Now, among these million are youth that came to the US from a very early age, preschooling age oftentimes. In our study, we found that on average, the deported youth back in Mexico had arrived in the US on the average at the age of 7 and had been deported at the age of 19. So most of their formative experience and their schooling was in the US, and now they're in Mexico. Many of them don't speak the language anymore and are struggling culturally. But among this group, there are also US citizen children who are forced to go to Mexico because their parents were deported and because of the extreme hardship that many immigrant families face here in the United States. So in my work, at the end, I'll sort of make the connection between the civic engagement of youth here and the emerging civic engagement of deported youth that work under the social-political socialization that they experience in the American context, that culturally identify as American, but are not able to be connected with their families and are often separated from their families. So that's the demographic context. In terms of the social-cultural context, As I'm sure all of you who have been following the presidential election in Donald Trump rising in the polls, we find ourselves in sort of this resurgence of an anti-immigrant context and sentiment, and it's everywhere. And so youth have to contend with that on a daily basis. That sets a stage for mental health challenges such as anxiety and depression. And research suggests, specifically for immigrant youth growing up in mixed status families, that for them, the anxiety levels are particularly high because of this, not knowing if one day they're going to come home and their parents are not going to be there, or a family member is going to be deported, or concerns about being separated. I mean, there's references in the research literature about older siblings having to take care of their younger siblings because the parents got deported, or one parent got deported, or having to work additional hours at jobs, or having to find multiple jobs to help the family financially because there was a deportation that separated a family member from the household. Another important challenge that undocumented youth have to contend with is the coming out process, identifying as undocumented to trustworthy individuals. So, one of the most impressive things about undocumented immigrant activists is that they've created an example for youth about how to channel this stigmatized identity and experience into one that is an identity of empowerment. So in 2010, we saw a brave group of young adults, young immigrant youth in Chicago, known as the Immigrant Youth Justice League, who held a press conference in front of the Sears Tower with the slogan, "Undocumented and Unafraid." And that was important because it created this national example of embracing that identity, of no longer having to hide or feel badly about that identity, and using it as a way to leverage engagement and empowerment. And that has continued to spread all throughout the country, beyond sort of college students, and is beginning to find its way among high school youth. And so in that demographic and social political context, in our research, we find that undocumented immigrant youth are civically engaged in a variety of ways. Now, it's not until they get to college that they really start to articulate that undocumented identity and come out publicly as undocumented. Many of them begin the civic participation in high school, not necessarily just on immigrant-related issues, but also on issues related to poverty, to educational access, and that's where the socialization begins. And so we have seen that, what happens in college creates pathways to adult careers in grassroots organizing and community-based work. So examples of these are United We Dream, which is probably the best known organization that is run by undocumented youth and was created by undocumented youth, and they become a very powerful voice in the immigrant rights conversation. And they were directly responsible for the passage of DACA, which is this federal law that President Obama signed that allows youth, certain undocumented youth, to gain temporary legal status. They were directly behind that. And these are youth that, were the first ones to come out in college as undocumented and unafraid. The DREAM Act Coalition is an officially registered lobbying group that is staffed by undocumented youth dreamers. So the Dreamer movement, these are two examples of organizations that I think exemplify what has been come to be known as the Dreamer movement. And so, so one of the important, I think, things that I want to highlight is that the college context is an important context that facilitates this empowerment and this civic engagement that we have seen and we continue to see. So these youth attain a college degree, and they continue into paths where they continue that activism. So an example of how some colleges and universities have facilitated this at UCLA, which is, UCLA in the Dreamer movement and the immigrant rights movement is an important place because it was the birthplace of the first college student group, UCLA Ideas, that really became known nationally for their activism on behalf of undocumented students. So UCLA has continued with that tradition of supporting undocumented youth activism and civic engagement. And so for the past 4 or 5 summers now, they have summer internship opportunities for undocumented youth that they call Dream Summer. And so they place youth all across the country in internships with community-based organizations, many of them who work on immigrant rights issues. And so this has increased that pipeline towards careers in community-based organizing and civic engagement and working with youth. But the important detail there is that civic engagement in all its forms happens primarily with college-going youth. So let me give you some numbers just to highlight, I think, where we need to focus our attention and where we need to go in terms of increasing undocumented youth civic participation. So a report that was recently released by colleagues at UCLA, Marcelo and Carola Suarez Orozco, highlights that nationally, every year, there are 122,000 undocumented high school seniors. Out of those 122,000, approximately 65,000 graduate from high school. Of those 65,000, approximately 31,000 are enrolled in some form of higher education, community college, public universities, 4 years. But out of that initial 122,000, only about 2,000 are able to get a college degree. And so you can see that there's a large segment of the undocumented youth population that are not able to access that context that nurtures undocumented youth civic engagement and participation. And we see that similar trend with in terms of those that have been able to benefit from DACA. So initially, we estimated that there would be about 1.7 million youth that would be eligible for DACA. As of today, there are approximately 500,000 youth that have applied and received DACA. Now that means that, just slightly less than half have been able to benefit, which means that there are many undocumented students still out there that face tremendous barriers, many of them which have been lowered by DACA, and continue to experience marginalization and lack of access to higher education and lack of access to a context that will allow them to increase their civic participation and to fully realize their potential. And so my work now focuses specifically on how do we do that. One of the ways in which I have come to, sort of think about how do we address that issue is to create links between the college-going undocumented youth and undocumented youth that are still in high school. Not only so that they can serve as role models about what's possible, what undocumented youth are capable of doing, and they can see a figure of somebody that shares their experience that is going to college and accomplishing great things, but also so that they can interact with youth that aren't necessarily academic superstars. I mean, one of the trends that I think is important to highlight is that the youth that are civically engaged and the youth that have benefited from DACA are youth that from very early in their schooling were put on the college track. So these are the honors and the AP kids and the college-going track. And that undocumented youth that are in the lower tracks, in the English learner track, in the track in which they're precluded from accessing the college-going curriculum, because in order to do that, they need to be reclassified as fluent English proficient. And there's no interaction. There's the segregation that happens with undocumented youth and with immigrant youth and with youth of color, for that matter, in the educational system. And so with undocumented youth activism, we see the results of this segregation. And so that, English learner youth don't have access to positive peer role models because of the separation. They're in different classes with different teachers and in different physical spaces in the schools. And so part of the work that we're trying to do is to figure out, how do we facilitate that dialogue? How do we facilitate that interaction so that more youth are able to see themselves as college material and have access to a resource that will help them navigate sort of the bureaucracy of schools that oftentimes precludes them from being able to take classes that will allow them to apply to college. So a lot of this has to do with lack of information. And so one of the, I think, inspiring things that I've seen in my work is college-going youth spend, in their student groups, in the student clubs, they spend a significant amount of time doing workshops, information workshops for parents, teachers, and undocumented high school students to provide information about options for higher education. But what I don't see in those interactions very much is this, kind of working together to help high school youth become civically engaged. It's more sort of this transaction of, here's what's available, here's what you need to know, here are resources for that, but less of a dialogue about how do we work together in sort of this activism work that we're doing in the community. There's less of that. One of the examples that we're beginning to see in the most recent work that I've been doing on indigenous Mexican immigrant youth is the creation of independent youth groups that are community-based, oftentimes supported by schools and educators and community-based organizations, where youth that have had different educational pathways come together. So in California Central Valley, for example, there is a large indigenous immigrant population. They work primarily in the agricultural fields. And many of these youth come from Mexican indigenous backgrounds. So for those of you who might not know about sort of that population, in Mexico, there are at least 65 different indigenous groups that speak their own indigenous language. And in the Central Valley, there are large concentrations of Mixtec and Zapotec Mexican indigenous families. And so this group that they call themselves Autónomos, Autónomos is a space where youth from the community come together, and that includes college youth, college-going youth, high school youth that are in the AP track and on the regular track and the English learner track, and youth that dropped out of high school, and youth that graduated from high school but didn't go to college. So to me, this is a great example that we're working to highlight and do some research around, because not only are they working on issues of immigration reform and undocumented students, there's a mix of documented, undocumented. They're working on language revitalization and language pride of indigenous Mexican languages. So for me, this serves as an example of the kinds of things that we could facilitate. For those of us who are interested in how do we support youth and civic engagement, I think helping in the creation of these spaces where youth with different educational pathways come together would be a great way to contribute to that. In California, we have pending legislation that would require all public colleges and universities to create dream centers. In the UC system, the new UC president, Janet Napolitano, has allocated funds to create dream centers at all the University of California system campuses. There's legislation now to increase that to the California State University system, which has the larger share of the undocumented population, and the community college system. And that legislation also includes the creation of dream centers in all high schools in California. So if passed, this would be a huge way to support high school youth who are undocumented in supporting their civic engagement. The other piece of legislation that we're all really excited about in California is the pending passage of ethnic studies curriculum at the high schools. So there are already districts in California, school districts, that have made it mandatory for students to take an ethnic studies course in order to graduate. We are just about to get legislation to Governor Brown's to sign a statewide initiative that would require that. And to me, that's important, as a tool for undocumented youth to begin to come out and embrace that undocumented identity at a much earlier time. And also for undocumented youth that are not necessarily on the academic track. For that, it is also going to be something that will be a space and an opportunity for undocumented youth in the English learner track or those that are not in the college-going track to explore and embrace this identity as an identity that can help them to become civically engaged and be part of the larger Dreamer movement that we've been seeing. And and what's been nice about what Dreamers have been able to accomplish is that their example has opened up the doors for students that are not necessarily academic superstars to enter higher education. And there's been really, I think, a fascinating dialogue between the sort of the AP track undocumented youth and the regular track undocumented youth who are now going to college together have had a very different educational experience. And so coming to, so it's been, there's been some, sort of having to renegotiate sort of some of the premises that youth develop in terms of the opportunity structure in American society and the questioning of that. And I see, to me, I think it's a brilliant evolution of this youth movement that we hope to continue to study in the years ahead so that we can highlight it for practitioners and those of us who are interested in positive youth development and understand how we can best allocate resources and play a role in facilitating this youth empowerment among undocumented students. I'll pause there and I look forward to an engaging conversation afterwards. Thank you.